Before the arches, before the columns, before the marble statues that watched the centuries pass, there was only the river. The Tiber flowed quiet and brown through the heart of a land divided by hills. On one of them, Palatine, small fires crackled in the dirt, and men with calloused hands built huts of straw and wood. These were not kings. They were shepherds, warriors, farmers, the kind of men who wore dust-like skin and who carved their laws into habit before they ever carved them into stone. No gods thundered in this birth. No wolves suckled children. That was later, the poetry of empire. What came first was location. Rome sat not at the sea, but close enough. A city inland enough to be defensible, yet connected by the Tiber's slow artery to the Mediterranean's pulse. 7 hills framed it. Swampland shielded it. Salt routes crossed it. Geography, not destiny, began it. Around 753 BCE, or so the Romans later decided, the early city formed. Not all at once, not with a founding moment, but gradually. Tribal settlements coalesced. Villages joined hands. Cultures blended. Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans. Neighbors, rivals, and soon, citizens of the same rising settlement. The Etruscans in particular left their fingerprints everywhere. In the early temple architecture, in their alphabet, in the rituals Romans later performed without understanding. The curved arch, that was Etruscan. The lictor's axe, symbol of state authority, Etruscan again. The Romans took what worked and filed the rest into tradition. By the 7th century BCE, Rome had become more than mud huts. Kings ruled. We know their names, not from myth, but from stone. Numa, Tullus, Ancus, and most of all, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. Under these early kings, the city was shaped by labor, forced and free. They drained the swamps between the hills and paved over them with the Forum Romanum, the city's heart for the next 1,000 years. They built the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer that still exists today, carved beneath layers of traffic and time. One of the most overlooked marvels of early Rome was its commitment to utility. Under King Servius Tullius, the city was divided into census-based tribes, an early prototype of social organization that determined taxes, military duty, and voting blocks. Citizens were grouped not by bloodlines, but by wealth. The higher your census class, the more military gear you were expected to provide. It was bureaucracy forged in bronze. By the end of the regal period, Rome had already built one of the oldest known roadways, the Via Sacra, and enclosed itself with stone walls. It had adopted Greek-styled armor from the south, Etruscan augury from the north, and designed a military levy system that assigned every male citizen to a class, and from there, to a battlefield. This was the world Rome was born into. A land of constant raiding, of city-states stealing cattle and captives from each other under the summer sun. Rome didn't grow because it was divinely chosen. It grew because it was prepared to organize violence better than anyone else. The Roman kings were not immortal. They were overthrown, not by gods, but by men with names. In 509 BCE, the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was exiled. Not for mythic reasons, but because his family committed an act so brutal, it shocked the ruling elite into permanent change. The people chose a different future. A republic, res publica, the public thing, run not by crowns, but by consuls, elected magistrates who ruled for only 1 year at a time. This shift was not peaceful. Rome's early republic was more a laboratory than a finished government. But it was radical. A city without kings, where the highest offices were time-limited, Power was shared, and the citizens themselves were the state. The Romans built their politics like they built their walls, layer by layer with setbacks and blood. Early struggles between the patricians, aristocratic elites, and the plebeians, commoners, weren't just class tension. They were system engineering. Out of those conflicts came the 12 Tables, a legal code etched into bronze and displayed in public. For the first time, the law wasn't spoken by the elite. It was written, visible, fixed. That idea still echoes in every modern constitution. By the close of this first chapter in Roman history, the city was no longer a village on the Tiber. It was a power on the rise. Still small, still surrounded by enemies, but with something extraordinary in its bones. A refusal to quit, a hunger to organize, and a belief, not in gods, but in structure, order, and the durability of the stone they placed one atop another. Rome's monarchy died in a household scandal, not on a battlefield. In 509 BCE, the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, slipped into exile, and the citizens he had terrorized made a wager the Mediterranean had never seen: that rotating offices could tame ambition better than any scepter. They called their experiment res publica, the public thing, and built its engine from mistrust. Every post faced a mirror, every decision a veto, power balanced like a gladius, kept upright on a fingertip. The new order functioned as a clockwork of magistrates. 2 consuls replaced 1 king, obliged to alternate command each lunar month so neither could steal an entire year. Praetors judged quarrels, quaestors chased coin, aediles policed markets and sewers. Censors graded citizens, then purged the Senate's rolls of the unworthy. Above them loomed that very Senate, a council of elders whose collective memory stretched further than any archive, steering policy with sarcasm and precedent. When catastrophe threatened, Rome unsheathed a 6-month dictatorship, unlimited authority ticking toward an immovable deadline. Grandeur, every Roman understood, should curdle quickly, yet structure concealed imbalance. Fewer than 150 patrician clans monopolized priesthoods and precedent, while the plebeians, who filled the legions and paid the taxes, found themselves spectators to decisions made in marble halls. In 494 BCE, entire cohorts marched out of the city and camped on the sacred mount, refusing war until they gained guardians. The strike birthed the tribunes of the plebs, 10 citizens whose single word, veto, I forbid, could freeze any action of state. Their bodies were declared untouchable. To strike one was treason against the people themselves. Over 2 centuries of walkouts, riots, and whispered bargains, the plebs prized open every locked door of privilege until the Lex Hortensia of 287 BCE declared their assembly's laws binding on patricians as well. A social contract had been soldered with protest and would prove harder than iron. Law, once proprietary priestcraft, became public property. After studying Greek codes in Magna Graecia, a Roman delegation returned in 451 BCE and etched the 12 Tables, rules of debt, inheritance, assault, dowry, onto bronze and bolted them to the forum wall. From that hour, a farmer in Etruria could recite a clause against a magistrate in Rome. Law was now visible, fixed, appealable. Commentaries multiplied under pens like Cicero's and Papinian's until shelves groaned with scrolls explaining those dozen slabs. Later, civilizations would quarry them for clauses, but in the Republic, they served as civic scripture, binding, secular, and portable wherever a standard bearer marched. Marching was Rome's genius. The legion, 4 800 citizens arranged in maniples that could pivot like joints of a single beast. Carried up to 45 kilograms apiece. Oval shield, iron helmet, 2 javelins, short sword, ration kit, and shovel. They covered 30 kilometers before noon, then dug a shoulder-deep moat, piled a turf wall, and hammered stakes in symmetrical rows before sleep. Dawn brought a bugle blast and a formation so precise, Polybius likened it to a living mural. Discipline bit harder than enemy steel. Theft yielded fustuarium, beating to death by comrades. Troop-wide panic invoked decimation. Every 10th man bludgeoned by the other 9. Terror welded courage, and courage carved roads. Between the ejection of kings and the first clash with Carthage, Rome subdued Etruscan hill fortresses, Samnite mountain clans, and the glittering Greek poleis of the southern coast. Conquered communities kept local councils yet owed troops and taxes. By the mid-3rd century, the Republic could summon 700,000 allied infantry in a single campaign season. Stone highways, Appia, Flaminia, Aemilia, stitched valleys and coasts. At 25-kilometer intervals, way stations offered fodder, water, and rumors. Couriers from the Alps could reach the Forum in 8 autumn days. Speed itself became a weapon. Then came the Punic Crucible. In the First Punic War, 264-241 BCE, land soldiers learned to sail. Carpenters copied a wrecked Carthaginian quinquerem plank for plank, built 120 hulls in 90 days, and added the corvus, a spiked gangway that turned naval duels into boarding actions, the legion's preferred grammar. Sicily changed flags. The Second Punic War, 218-201 BCE, produced nightmare. Hannibal Barca threaded 37 elephants through snow-blind alpine passes, enveloped consular armies at Trebia and Lake Trasimene. Then in 216 BCE at Cannae, killed 50,000 Romans between sunrise and dusk. Rome refused capitulation, adopted Fabian delay, strangled supply lines, and finally counter-invaded Africa. At Zama, Scipio Africanus reversed Hannibal's famous pincer and ended Carthaginian ambition. The Third Punic War, 149-146 BCE, served as grim housekeeping. After a stubborn siege, legions leveled Carthage stone by stone and sold 50,000 survivors into bondage. Debate, not salt, was sown into the ashes. Could a republic erasing cities still claim virtue? The Senate answered by drafting new provincial tax ledgers. With the Western Sea secured, eyes turned east toward the fractured heirs of Alexander the Great. Macedonia fell after Pydna in 168 BCE. The Seleucid line broke at Magnesia, and Rome proclaimed freedom for the Greeks, a euphemism payable in tribute coined with Roman eagles. Generals returned laden with marble statues, astronomical treatises, and a taste for Syrian glass. By 100 BCE, revenues from Asia Minor alone topped 20 million denarii annually, enough grain to feed the swelling city for months. Prosperity arrived tangled with peril. By the cusp of the 1st century BCE, Rome's population brushed 1 million. 1 in 3 inhabitants was enslaved. Convoys funneled 150,000 tons of wheat yearly through Ostia's warehouses, while vigils patrolled insulae, tenement mazes 4 stories high, against fire and midnight collapse. Senators converted conquered land into latifundia, estates tilled by chained captives. Smallholders sold dusty plots and drifted into urban queues for subsidized grain. To divert discontent, magistrates lengthened festival calendars until spectacles filled 170 days a year. The crowd roared, the Republic's foundations vibrated like drums before a march. Reform attempted surgery on this swelling inequality. Tiberius Gracchus, in 133 BCE, proposed land ceilings. A senatorial mob beat him to death with table legs. Gaius Gracchus offered grain laws and Italian citizenship. He fell on a slave sword before pursuers could exhibit his head. Violence had entered the forum. Soon Gaius Marius opened enlistment to the landless, promising plunder and allotments. Loyalty shifted from Senate to general. Lucius Cornelius Sulla marched on Rome twice, nailed proscription lists that condemned 4,700 citizens, rewrote the Constitution, then retired to literature and wine. Spartacus led 70,000 slaves in parades of panic until crucifixes lined the Via Appia like grim milestones. Pompey Magnus cleared 1,000 pirate ships in 9 months and celebrated 3 triumphs. Crassus, richer than most provinces, died at Carrhae pursuing Parthian gold. His severed head filled with molten silver before presentation to a laughing king. Through this maelstrom strode Julius Caesar. Between 58 and 50 BCE, he bridged the Rhine in 10 days, crossed to Britain twice, and reduced Gaul, an expanse larger than modern France, to obedient silence. Dispatches he wrote on campaign turned massacre into Latin prose devoured nightly in Rome. He claimed 800 towns, enslaved or enrolled 1 million souls, and enriched soldiers until their purses rattled like plate armor. Ordered home to stand trial, he led 1 legion across the Rubicon, murmuring Alea iacta est, the die is cast, and civil war erupted across 3 continents. Pompey died at Egyptian shorelines. Caesar returned, reinscribed the calendar into the 365-day cycle still used, planned Parthian conquest, and accepted a lifetime dictatorship. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, the 23 blades wrote a different future into his flesh. Assassins expected liberty. They conjured vendetta. Cicero thundered against tyranny. Antony roused veterans. Octavian, Caesar's teenage heir, wove patience and patronage into nets. More prescriptions followed. Severed heads decorated the rostra beneath a blinding sun. In 31 BCE at Actium, Octavian's fleet cornered Antony and Cleopatra against an Ionian headwind and broke them. 3 years later, the doors of Janus, Temple of War, were closed, and peace, or something like it, settled like dust on marble. In 27 BCE, the Senate bestowed on Octavian the title Augustus, the Revered. He declined crowns, but monopolized legions, treasury, and tribunician veto. Consuls were still elected, laws still engraved, senators still debated. Yet every verdict traced a quiet line back to one house perched on the Palatine. The Republic had not been abolished, it had been embalmed. Its relics, written statutes, citizen armies, milestone roads, the stubborn conviction that power should answer to structure, became heirlooms that every later empire would borrow or break. The curtain descends on the Republic, yet the stage remains. When it rises again, Rome will speak in marble facades, garrison the frontiers in chainmail rhythm, and legislate in the measured tents of emperors poised to inherit the world. Rome in 27 BCE felt exhausted, like a gladiator propped upright by habit alone. Veterans limped through triumphal arches, grain ships queued at Ostia, and every citizen could list the civil wars by season. Into that weariness, Octavian offered steadiness. He refused crowns, but accepted every power linked to them. Princeps, he said, first citizen. Yet 28 legions saluted only him. Armies that once voted with feet and swords were chained to frontier rivers: Rhine, Danube, Euphrates. Their eagle standards faced outward now. Civil bloodletting was declared bad form. He audited the empire like a bookkeeper. A census counted 5 million citizens, 200 provincial towns, and untold allies who paid tribute in wheat, wool, and wine. Roads were resurfaced and travertine. Milestones sprouted inscriptions of his family name. Temples, 82 by his own boast, rose or were restored. The Pantheon's first incarnation glittered with limestone under a Roman sun that Augustus advertised as Reborn. Moral laws fined bachelors, rewarded motherhood, and outlawed silken extravagance. Livia, his wife, wore pearls no wider than lentils, at least before statues. Peace, though, had a spear point. In 9 CE, 3 legions under Varus wandered into the Teutoburg forest and vanished. When news reached Rome, Augustus smashed his head against a doorframe and cried, "Varus, give me back my legions." Their lost eagles would haunt every campfire myth north of the Rhine. Augustus tightened recruitment, recruited auxiliaries, Batavi horsemen, Syrian archers, Iberian slingers. Foreign sons promised citizenship in exchange for 25 winters of loyalty. He died in 14 CE, claiming he had found Rome brick and left it marble. The Senate wept, though its benches knew theater when they heard it. Tiberius succeeded, a general who loathed crowds. He governed by letter from the island of Capri, letting the praetorian prefect Sejanus police Rome with whisper networks and secret arrests. Grain arrived, aqueducts flowed, but joy dried like dew before noon. Sejanus fell to intrigue, and Tiberius, old and suspicious, let his final edicts bleed ink rather than charisma. A pendulum then swung too far the other way. Gaius Caligula began as a welcomed grandson of Germanicus, parading in miniature armor to ovations. Within months, he bankrupted the treasury on games, threatened to appoint his horse consul, and ordered the legions to collect seashells in Gaul as spoils from Neptune. Assassins from his own guard stabbed him in a theater corridor. The Praetorians, finding Claudius hiding behind a curtain, hailed him emperor to protect their privileges. Claudius, stuttering scholar, shocked Rome by proving competent. He annexed Britannia, a fog-wrapped island Julius Caesar had only visited, and built the massive harbor at Portus with a double-curved breakwater and a lighthouse crowned by a colossal statue. He reformed grain supply chains, allowed Gauls into the Senate, and wrote 20 volumes of Etruscan history no one quotes because Nero, his grandnephew and adopted son, burned the library that housed them. Nero inherited at 17 and began well, replacing capital punishment with exile, banning secret trials. Then came lyric poetry recitals that dragged past midnight, palace races against chariots of gilded mules, and finally the Great Fire of 64 CE. 2/3 of Rome burned amid summer wind. Rumors accused the emperor of singing while rooftops collapsed. To deflect blame, Nero pointed at a small Jewish sect called Christians and lit them as human torches along the Vatican slopes. Rebuilding plans financed a palace whose rotating dining room mimicked the cosmos. Provinces revolted. The Senate declared him an enemy. Nero fled to a villa east of the city and opened his veins, lamenting that such an artist should die. A single year, 69 CE, saw 4 emperors crowned and discarded. Galba, Otho, Vitellius fell in rapid sequence, replaced by armies marching from Spain, Germania, and the Danube. The winner was Vespasian, gruff, humorous, born in a Sabine village. He taxed public urinals, fixed roads, and broke ground on an amphitheater that would seat 50,000 beneath awnings rigged like ship sails. Workers quarried travertine from Tivoli, and scrawled graffito predicting gladiators' victories. Scholars later called the arena the Colosseum, after Nero's abandoned colossal statue nearby. Vespasian's sons inherited a treasury finally in surplus. Titus opened the Colosseum with 100 days of games, lions against prisoners, naval reenactments flooded by aqueduct, and quelled the Jewish revolt by raising the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Its menorah, a march to Rome on a carved triumphal arch. A volcanic thunderhead then appeared over Campania in 79 CE. Vesuvius exploded, entombing Pompeii and Herculaneum in ash, hot enough to vaporize flesh, yet preserve frescoes of dancing gods nobody worshipped anymore. He died of fever. Domitian, his brother, ruled 15 years, calling himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and paying legions well to ensure applause. He rebuilt Rome's fire-scarred tenements in concrete and launched the Limes Germanicus, a palisade and ditch snaking 550 kilometers between Rhine and Danube. Senators loathed him. Palace slaves murdered him in 96 CE. The next century opened like a well-oiled door. Nerva, elderly but amiable, adopted the respected General Trajan, establishing succession by merit rather than blood. Trajan spent 13 of 19 ruling years with the army, extending the empire to its maximum map. Dacia's gold mines in modern Romania, Arabia Petraea's frankincense roots, and Mesopotamia's twin rivers. At Apollodorus of Damascus's urging, he cut a commercial road across the Jordanian desert, then celebrated with a forum crowned by a spiral column, whose bas-relief depicts 2,662 soldiers and one dog. Trajan died on the way home from illness. His courier delivered adoption papers naming Hadrian. Hadrian abandoned overstretched Mesopotamian gains, built a wall 117 kilometers across northern Britain, stone, turf, mile castles, and an inscription bragging of Aelius Hadrianus consolidating empire. He traveled incessantly, Athens, Egypt, Asia Minor, comparing architecture and enshrining Greek philosophy in imperial libraries. His villa at Tivoli sprawled wider than small towns and featured a pool reflecting porticos shaped after the Stoa in Athens. Yet he could be merciless. The Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea ended with 500,000 dead, and the province renamed Syria Palestina to erase memory. Old and heartsick over the drowning of his beloved Antinous in the Nile, Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius on condition he adopt Hadrian's chosen successor. Antoninus ruled 23 calm years without leaving Italy, lowering frontier wars to skirmishes and treasury ledgers to tidy columns. His reign felt like an exhale between storms, commemorated by coinage advertising peace as a seated woman holding an olive branch. That chosen successor was Marcus Aurelius, philosopher in a cuirass. He wrote Meditations in Greek by lamplight among Danubian winters, lines about accepting fate like a ripe fig dropping from a tree. Fate, meanwhile, carried plague from the east, perhaps smallpox, that killed an estimated 5 million, including co-emperor Lucius Verus. Marcus spent 16 years on campaign, repelling Germanic tribes, financing war by selling palace silver at a public auction. At Vindobona, modern Vienna, he dictated that a good man must do the work of humanity, then died in 180 CE. His son Commodus inherited, but his tale belongs to another chapter of decline. For now, Rome at the end of Marcus's reign remained colossal. 65 million subjects, 400,000 kilometers of roads, taxes standardized in silver denarii, whose content had only begun to slip. A network of aqueducts poured 300 million liters of water daily into baths where citizens debated chariot teams and legal appeals. Grain fleets from Africa fed a capital still flashing marble under Mediterranean sun. The Colosseum's canvas awnings creaked. Legionaries on Hadrian's Wall watched purple heather bloom. And scholars in Alexandria copied Galen's anatomy treatises. 2 centuries earlier, the Republic's last consul had lamented that freedom bled away under marching boots. Yet the empire those boots secured would, for a century and a half, deliver a relative order the world remembered with impossible longing, the Pax Romana. It was not gentle. Rebellions were crucified, provinces taxed. But within its guarded borders, a merchant could travel from Seville to Damascus, changing only dialects, not rulers. At night, tavern owners lit oil lamps whose bronze bases bore the same imperial profile. Across the room, soldiers rolled dice inscribed with Latin pips. And somewhere beyond the wooden door, a milestone counted distance to Rome, center of a world thumping in marble rhythm. When Marcus's funeral pyre dimmed against the northern sky, the empire still looked limitless. Yet hairline cracks already veined the facade, waiting for history's thumb to press. The fire that seared Marcus Aurelius to ash smoldered for weeks on the damp banks of the Danube, as if reluctant to surrender the warmth of a philosopher king. When the wind finally scattered the embers, Rome inherited his son Commodus, a ruler molded more by applause than by duty. At first, the capital exhaled. Succession, at least, was smooth. But within months, statues of Hercules sprouted across the forum, with Commodus's own features chiseled in heroic marble. He fought tame gladiators in choreographed bouts and counted each rehearsed kill as a sign of divine favor. Grain fleets drifted idle, while he renamed the months after himself. In outposts along the Rhine, veterans spat into hearth fires and wondered whether the world's master had traded laurel for laureled vanity. In 192 CE, an enslaved wrestler strangled Commodus in a bath scented with imported myrrh. No legion marched to avenge him. No crowd risked mourning. The Praetorian Guard, sensing vacancy, auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus bought the empire with promises of 25,000 sestertii per soldier, then discovered that wealth cannot purchase loyalty already sold. Beyond the Alps, 3 provincial commanders pressed legions forward like rival tides. The first to arrive was Septimius Severus, a hard-edged Pannonian who dismissed the guard, executed their ringleaders on the steps of the Curia, and replaced the silk-soft palace troops with veterans from Illyria, whose scars served as resumes. Rome's institutions, bruised but breathing, bent to a new dynasty. Severus raised his pay for ordinary soldiers from 1,200 to 2,000 denarii a year, and let them marry legally for the first time, tying family fortunes to the fortunes of the eagle standards. Yet every coin he minted diluted silver content, and every victory parade hid the bill for loyalty. Before dying in northern Britain, he warned his sons, "Live in harmony, enrich the soldiers, and despise all others." Caracalla obeyed the middle clause with civic largesse, and the last with lethal enthusiasm. Within months of their father's funeral, Caracalla lured his brother Geta to their mother's apartments and cut him down in her arms, splattering imperial purple with familial red. To mask fratricide, he proclaimed the Constitutio Antoniniana, extending Roman citizenship to every free inhabitant of the empire, an act celebrated by jurists for its universality, lamented by tax collectors for its cunning. Citizenship once earned through service or patronage, now came packaged with new fiscal obligations, an empire-wide levy to feed an ever-hungry treasury. Caracalla built colossal baths warmed by furnaces that devoured a hillside of timber each day, their domes echoing with splashes of men whose taxes had financed the steam curling above their heads. In 217 CE, a disgruntled centurion buried a dagger between Caracalla's ribs on an Anatolian roadside, and the throne passed to brief caretakers. Macrinus, a lawyer elevated by conspiracy; Elagabalus, a teenage Syrian priest who married a Vestal virgin and replaced Jupiter with a sunstone cult; Alexander Severus, earnest yet smothered by the intrigue that nursed him. Each reign shortened the empire's patience. When Germanic war bands breached the limes, legionaries found themselves following emperors whose names they learned after the first trumpet call. By 235 CE, rank no longer flowed from Rome, but from camps along the frontier. Maximinus Thrax, a Thracian shepherd said to drink wine by the gallon, became emperor without ever stepping inside the Senate house. He doubled military pay and marched ceaselessly, but his appetite for coin dwarfed his aptitude for governance. The Praetorian Guard murdered the next imperial trio, Pupienus, Balbinus, and Gordian, in one summer, staining palace corridors with blood that congealed before the marble cooled. Plague returned, an unwelcome memory from the reign of Marcus, now called the Plague of Cyprian. Scribes described throats burning like lime kilns and limbs blackening like rotten figs. In Alexandria alone, 5,000 per day were said to perish. Labor collapsed. Villas stood empty and fields gone to thistle, coffers hollowed. To pay troops, emperors shaved silver out of coinage, until a denarius, once 95% pure, rattled dull as tin. Inflation climbed like ivy around every market stall. A loaf of bread that cost 2 asses in Marcus's day cost 50 under Gallienus. The empire did not fall in a day. It bent, restructured, and disguised its wounds in marble. But by the time Diocletian came, Rome was no longer eternal. It was exhausted, bleeding along borders and rotting at the core. A century of chaos had softened the old steel. Between emperors and impostors, Rome had known more claimants than seasons. Generals declared themselves Caesar in frontier camps. Their coinage outpaced their lifespans. Barracks emperors rose by acclaim of soldiers and often fell the same year. Civil wars flared like torches along the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates. Gaul declared independence. Palmyra ruled the east for a heartbeat. Rome, the city, not the idea, watched from its 7 hills as the world frayed into provinces at war with each other. It was Diocletian who halted the spin. He came not from senatorial families, but from the gritty stone of Dalmatia, the son of a freedman who rose through the ranks not by birthright, but by command. In 284 CE, he seized the purple, and rather than crown himself the singular savior of Rome, he did what no one had dared. He split power in 2. He appointed Maximian as co-emperor, Augustus of the West, while he ruled the East. To manage succession, they chose 2 junior emperors, Caesars under the senior Augusti. This was the tetrarchy: 4 emperors, 4 capitals, 4 swords drawn toward stability. It was not unity, but it was order. Diocletian restructured everything: tax systems, military districts, provincial boundaries, all recalibrated. He reorganized the army, securing borders not with roaming legions, but with stationed frontier units backed by mobile reserves. Forts studded the Rhine and Danube. A chain of defenses formed a new skin. Cities shrank into walled garrisons, marketplaces folded inward. Rome itself faded in significance. Power was now wherever emperors set up camp. To finance the structure, Diocletian launched the most extensive census in Roman history. Every animal, every acre, every hand that could plow or weave was registered. Taxes became predictable, but heavy. To stabilize inflation, he issued an edict on maximum prices, freezing the cost of everything from a haircut to a lion. It failed. Barter replaced coin in many regions, and black markets bloomed under the marble noses of statues. Yet, something had changed. Rome could still breathe. He retired in 305 CE, an act almost un-Roman in humility, and retreated to a coastal palace in Dalmatia, where cabbages grew in geometries far simpler than empire. But Rome did not allow peace. The tetrarchy shattered in his absence. Ambition, rivalry, blood. Within 6 years, one man stood over the wreckage, Constantine, son of Constantius Chlorus, hailed by troops in Britain, a survivor of palace plots and battlefield gauntlets. Constantine saw in the East not only survival, but salvation. He marched through Gaul, crossed the Alps, and faced Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. The night before battle, a vision, whether of strategy or something claimed divine, convinced him to mark his soldiers' shields with a symbol, Chi Rho, the first letters of the name Christos. Victory followed. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber. Constantine entered Rome through streets scattered in rose petals and trembling rumors. The emperor had seen a sign. He was no mere convert, but a tactician. Christianity, long persecuted, was now legal under the Edict of Milan. Temples remained, but churches multiplied. Bishops began to wear robes that echoed senatorial styles. The empire's soul began to pivot, not overnight, but decisively. In 330 CE, Constantine founded a new capital on the ancient site of Byzantium, a Greek city on the Bosporus Strait. It would be called Nova Roma, but the world knew it as Constantinople. He poured marble, gold, and grain into its making. A senate hall, a hippodrome for chariot races, aqueducts, basilicas, and a palace overlooking the sea. Rome had a twin now, one foot in Europe, one in Asia. Traders called it the pivot of the world. Constantine ruled until 337 CE, baptized only on his deathbed, as if hedging bets until his final breath. He left behind 3 sons and a fracturing structure. The empire split again between heirs. In the east, power congealed. In the west, it splintered. Still, life went on in mosaics and marble. Markets reopened. Roads hummed with merchants. Laws were codified, collected into vast tomes like the Codex Theodosianus, the ancestor of civil law across centuries. Artists carved sarcophagi that told biblical stories in the language of myth. Gold solidi became the standard of exchange from Britain to India. Yet beneath the surface, pressures built. Barbarians were no longer distant silhouettes in the mist. The Goths, pushed westward by Hunnic invasions from the steppes, begged Rome for asylum. They were settled south of the Danube, meant to farm and defend the frontier. But the empire fed them poorly, taxed them ruthlessly. In 378 CE, the Goths rebelled, and at Adrianople, they shattered the Eastern army. Emperor Valens died in the field, burned in a peasant's cottage after fleeing the battle. It was the worst defeat since Teutoburg. The empire reeled. Its walls still stood, but its reputation cracked. Emperors grew desperate. Generalship became the real crown. In 395 CE, Theodosius Thirst died, the last man to rule both East and West as one. His sons inherited halves of a bleeding animal. One ruled from Milan, the other from Constantinople. The divide was no longer administrative. It was spiritual, economic, and cultural. Latin held in the West. Greek blossomed in the East. Marble forums decayed in Rome, while Constantinople sparkled under fresh cornices. The Rhine frontier weakened. Troops once bound to Caesar now fought for land, gold, or survival. The legions were no longer Roman-born. Their loyalty was hireling deep. Grain fleets faltered. Roads became pathways for war bands. A world still vast, but vibrating with the sound of splitting timbers. Yet it had not yet fallen. Women still carried amphorae from cisterns in the forum. Bakers still kneaded dough in Pompeian ovens. Couriers galloped across provinces with scrolls sealed in wax. The empire still taxed, still dictated edicts in the name of Rome. Temples were repurposed, gods forgotten. But the bureaucracy, the magnificent machine, clanked on. In the East, learning flourished. Libraries copied the old scrolls of Galen and Ptolemy. Silver was struck with imperial profiles. The imperial purple still dyed tunics and stained fingertips of those who wove power into clothing. And in Constantinople, the sun rose over a city built not on legend, but on steel, stone, and survival. Rome was no longer what it was, but it was still something too vast to bury. Something that, for now, still called itself eternal. But cracks widened, silently, year by year. Emperors no longer governed from Rome, nor trusted the Senate to steer policy. The Western court drifted from Milan to Ravenna, a city girded by marshes, easier to defend, but farther from the center of the old world. It was a choice born of fear. Armies could no longer guarantee the safety of the eternal city. Rome, once the sun at the center of empire, now flickered like a dying torch behind defensive walls. The world beyond those walls changed faster than emperors could adjust. From the vast Eurasian steppe, pressure mounted like tectonic shifts. The Huns, fierce, fast, and nearly mythic in their brutality, pressed westward. They shattered tribes like bone through linen, sending ripples through the Germanic world. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Alans, peoples once held at bay by coin or treaty, now surged like tidewater across borders once drawn in iron. These peoples did not always come as enemies. Many had fought for Rome, traded with Rome, adopted its tongue, its laws, even its faith. But desperation has a gravity that overrides familiarity. Rome's system, even divided and restructured, could no longer carry the weight of centuries. In the East, emperors attempted adaptation. Gold flowed from Constantinople's treasuries to secure treaties, subsidize border tribes, and recruit mercenary forces to defend the walls. They built layers upon layers of bureaucratic response. New tax systems, legal appeals, religious councils. They argued over the nature of Christ more than the state, convening grand councils in Nicaea, Constantinople, and Antioch to debate what was heresy and what was orthodoxy. Christianity, now more than a tolerated faith, became a weaponized institution, used to define citizenship, loyalty, and identity. Pagans, once Rome's moral core, were now outlaws in their own temples. Theodosius I, the last emperor of both East and West, banned all forms of traditional polytheism, shuttering temples, ending sacrifices, and declaring the gods of old to be lies, carved in stone. The Vestal virgins were dismissed. The Oracle of Delphi went silent. The Pantheon, once echoing with prayers to all gods, would soon be baptized in the name of one. This was not merely religious change, it was civilizational realignment. Sculptors who once carved Jupiter now chiseled saints. Basilicas rose where forums crumbled. Bishops became governors in robes. Emperors no longer sought legitimacy from the Senate, but from the Church. A spiritual empire had begun to eclipse the physical one. Meanwhile, in the West, military pressure mounted. The Rhine froze over in winter, and barbarian tribes crossed not as raiders, but as whole nations. Entire villages traveled, men, women, elders, children, with ox carts, livestock, and centuries of resentment. Roman commanders tried to negotiate, sometimes with words, sometimes with steel. But steel was in short supply. Loyalty thinner still. Army units deserted. Fortresses fell not in battle, but by abandonment. Still, the machinery of empire persisted, because it had to. It was built to endure calamity. Even in the face of fragmentation, Roman law continued to be copied and administered. Governors still collected taxes, even as trade declined and cities shrank. Grain ships from Africa were less frequent, but annona, the grain dole, was still issued in Rome, though in smaller, shorter lines. Gladiators still fought, though the crowds grew thin. The Colosseum had begun to rust at its iron joints. Some emperors still dreamed in marble. Julian, nephew of Constantine and student of philosophy, attempted to restore Rome's pagan past. He wore his beard long, consulted with Neoplatonist sages, and rejected the Christian faith his uncle had once legitimized. He marched east to war with Persia, but died before his revival could take root. His final words, "You have won, Galilean." By 395 CE, Theodosius's death formalized what had already become reality. The empire was now two empires, not twin halves, but diverging entities. The Eastern Empire, with its Greek bureaucracy, gold-rich treasury, and fortified capital, stood poised for survival. The West, with its worn infrastructure, shallow leadership pool, and fractured loyalties, entered its dusk. Yet Rome did not fall with a scream. It whispered into darkness slowly. Roads still bore the weight of mule hooves and imperial couriers. Latin remained the language of law. Even as it fractured into dialects we would one day call French, Spanish, Italian. The shape of Roman administration lived on in the churches and in the codices. A villa's wall, cracked and faded, still bore frescoes of Venus, now ignored by children raised on Gospels. And across the Bosporus, in the marble halls of Constantinople, the empire that once marched from Hadrian's wall to the Syrian desert redefined itself. Not as Rome's successor, but as Rome itself. The emperors of the East would rule for another 1,000 years, cloaked not in senatorial tradition, but in Byzantine silk, beneath domes of mosaic, beside altars of burning incense. They called themselves Romans. The world would later call them Byzantines. In the West, the embers cooled, but in the East, the fire burned on. After Theodosius died in 395 CE, the Roman world split down its spine. East and West, once divided only by provincial lines, now stood as separate empires with separate destinies. The wealthier half, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, braced itself behind gold-trimmed bureaucracy and Greek literacy. The West, poorer, stretched thinner with each passing winter. Honorius, a boy emperor of the West, inherited Ravenna and a throne built on hope and precedent. He was just 10 years old when the legions along the Rhine vanished, not in battle, but into silence. In 406 CE, as snow crusted the riverbanks, waves of Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the frozen Rhine. It wasn't an invasion, it was a migration. Tribes, wagons, elders, and children. pushed westward by deeper pressures, by hunger, by the shadow of the Huns. Those Huns moved like tempests across the steppe. Mounted, scarred, nomadic, they arrived without kings, but with terrifying cohesion. Cities didn't slow them. Rivers didn't stop them. Their arrows bent mid-flight and struck like falling stars. Refugees fled before them. Roman generals, already overburdened, chose between defending cities or chasing ghosts through forests. Alaric, a Visigoth, had once fought under Rome's banners. He had been promised land. Instead, he received delay. Dismissed by courts and insulted by diplomats, Alaric finally led his army south, not as a barbarian horde, but as a disappointed ally. In 410 CE, his forces encircled Rome itself. And then, they opened the gates. For 3 days, the Eternal City, untouched by foreign hands in 800 years, was ransacked. Not burned, not razed, but violated. Gold statues were toppled, patrician villas were looted, churches were spared, but robbed just the same. The Roman world shuddered. Saint Jerome wrote from Bethlehem, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Rome survived the sack, but not unchanged. It was no longer the capital. Ravenna had taken that role. Nor was it the heart of empire. Constantinople pulsed brighter. The Western Empire continued, technically. Emperors still reigned, though fewer could command an army. The Senate still met, though its edicts were often ignored. Most crucially, the legions were no longer Roman. They were Gothic, Frankish, Hunnic. Their loyalty lay with paymasters, not ideals. In Gaul, a man named Aetius fought like he still believed. Raised among Huns as a hostage, fluent in the shifting languages of survival, he became Magister Militum, master of soldiers, and held the West together through alliances and blood. He paid tribes to fight other tribes. He negotiated, threatened, retreated, and returned. When Attila, now crowned king of the Huns, marched west with the fury of a storm, it was Aetius who stood in his path. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE, Roman auxiliaries, Visigoths, and remnants of empire collided with Attila's horde near modern-day France. It was a staggering clash. Cavalry crashed like thunder, arrows blackened the sky, men drowned in mud, slicked with blood. Attila retreated, not defeated but checked. Rome celebrated. Aetius, however, was rewarded with a dagger. The Emperor Valentinian III, fearing his general's popularity, stabbed him during an audience. The West had killed its last competent defender. The knife wound did more than sever a man. It snapped the spine of a dying world. Without Aetius, the empire became a stage with no actor, a shell where shadows played dress-up as emperors. The court in Ravenna filled with flatterers and eunuchs. Civil war became seasonal, like floods. Rome's enemies no longer marched to conquer. They marched to settle disputes, collect unpaid promises, or install puppets. In 455 CE, Rome was sacked again. This time by the Vandals. They arrived by sea, not land, led by Genseric. For 14 days they stripped what remained of the old capital. Gold, ivory, statuary, relics, carted to Carthage on ships heavy with spoil. Unlike Alaric's sack, this one had time and malice. Vessels of sacred oil were shattered. Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her daughters were taken as hostages. The word Vandal would forever bear their name. Meanwhile, the empire's borders were no longer defended, but negotiated. In Britain, Roman rule had already collapsed. The legions had been withdrawn decades earlier. Left to themselves, Romano-British warlords battled Saxon invaders in fragmented skirmishes, their villas crumbling to moss-covered stone. Across Hispania and Gaul, Visigothic kingdoms sprouted like weeds in unattended gardens. The empire did not fall with a sword. It fell like old paint, peeling in layers, flaking into silence. In Italy, Germanic generals controlled the army. Ricimer, a barbarian by birth and Roman by ambition, appointed and deposed emperors like chess pieces. One ruled for 3 months, another for a year. None lasted. They issued edicts no one enforced. By the 470s, the empire's territory was no larger than a few Italian provinces. Tax collectors were unpaid, roads untended. The Senate now sent more letters east to Constantinople than it did to its own emperor. Then came Romulus Augustulus, a teenager placed on the throne in 475 CE by his father, Orestes. His name, Romulus, like the founder of Rome. Augustulus, a mockery of Augustus, read like the last line of a tragic poem. He wore purple but ruled nothing. When Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain once in Roman service, marched on Ravenna, there was no resistance. In 476 CE, Odoacer entered the palace and spared the boy. No dramatic death, no burning senate, no gods fleeing Olympus. Romulus was sent to live with relatives in Campania, given a pension. The Western Roman Empire, the empire of Caesar and Cicero, of Hannibal and Hadrian, simply ended. A single letter was sent to Constantinople, declaring the office of emperor vacant. Zeno, the Eastern emperor, never bothered to refill it. But Rome did not vanish. Its laws remained, embedded in codes that would shape European justice for centuries. Its language persisted in the Latin tongues of Spain, France, and Italy. Its roads still led to ruined towns. Its aqueducts cast shadows on new cities. Its architecture was mimicked in churches. Its republic whispered into constitutions. Even its decline would be copied by every empire that came after. The Senate still met in name for another century. The church rose from the city's ashes like a phoenix made of parchment and ritual. The Pope filled the void left by emperors, and basilicas replaced temples. Crosses replaced eagles. But marble still glowed in the sun. Tourists still carved their names into columns already ancient. The Roman world had not collapsed in one act, but evaporated over decades. No single day, no single battle, no final trumpet. It crumbled the way mountains do, under their own weight, over generations. The West fell because it could not pay its defenders, could not feed its cities, could not inspire loyalty beyond its borders. Because its heartbeat no longer reached its extremities. Because even stone gets tired. Yet, in a distant eastern capital, in Constantinople, purple robes still rustled, coins still bore imperial faces, and Latin phrases still echoed in halls. The story of Rome would continue, not as memory, but as transformation. The Western Empire had died, but the idea of Rome was not so easily buried. The empire never truly fell. It shifted east, changed names, and wrapped itself in silk and scripture. In the marble palaces of Constantinople, they still called themselves Romans. The Senate survived, though it was mostly ceremonial. The emperor still wore purple, bore the title Basileus, and was crowned not by soldiers, but by patriarchs in a church of gold. Greek, not Latin, ruled the streets, and Christ, not Jupiter, reigned from heaven. But to the men in robes and armor, the lineage was unbroken. They were heirs of Augustus, Caesar, and Constantine. The city itself was a fortress of marvels. Its walls, triple-layered and 15 meters high, ran 12 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. Behind them, domes gleamed in the sun. At the city's heart rose Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so vast it stunned diplomats from forests and deserts alike. Its floating dome, supported by hidden ribs and arcades, seemed to hang from heaven by an invisible thread. Gold mosaics shimmered on every surface. Emperors in robes, saints with solemn eyes, Christ enthroned above all. In 527 CE, the empire crowned Justinian, a man born in the Balkans, son of peasants, who rose by force of intellect and ruthlessness. He dreamed not of survival, but of restoration. The West, lost to barbarians, was still his in name. So he raised taxes, crushed rebellions, and summoned two men to reshape history: Belisarius, his general, and Tribonian, his jurist. With sword and scroll, Justinian aimed to reunite the empire. Belisarius rode west at the head of fleets and fire. He recaptured Carthage, defeated the Vandals, and marched into Italy. Rome, a shattered relic, welcomed him as a liberator. But Gothic wars dragged on for nearly 2 decades, and the conquest left the peninsula depopulated, its aqueducts severed, its farms abandoned. Still, by 554 CE, the western Mediterranean once again glittered with imperial banners, from southern Spain to North Africa to the heel of Italy. At home, Justinian rebuilt Constantinople after riots nearly consumed it. He rewrote Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a code that would echo in European legal systems 1,000 years later. He reformed the bureaucracy, tightened tax collection, and declared heresies illegal. But his victories came at a price. Plague, a pestilence that would later be called Justinian's Plague, swept through the empire in 541 CE, killing millions. Some say half the population perished. Cities emptied, fields rotted, graves overflowed. Justinian died in 565 CE, exhausted and alone, having spent more than he gained. His grand reconquests drained the treasury and exposed borders. But his shadow endured. The law, the architecture, the ambition, all left fingerprints on ages to come. His successors struggled. The Persians returned. Slavs and Avars swept into the Balkans. The Lombards claimed northern Italy. Constantinople began to shrink, not in grandeur, but in confidence. Then, in the early 7th century, a storm rose from the Arabian deserts. The rise of Islam redrew the world's borders. Within decades, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, the grain basket and cultural heartland of the old empire, were lost to the caliphate. These lands, once Roman for 7 centuries, now prayed in Arabic and no longer sent taxes to Byzantium. Constantinople watched, stunned, as ancient pillars fell to crescent flags. Yet the empire did not collapse. It adapted. The Byzantines, as historians would later call them, abandoned the Latin West. They fortified the Anatolian plateau. Greek became the official language. Icons of saints replaced busts of emperors. The state fused with faith. The emperor was no longer just ruler. He was God's vice-regent on earth. In 717 CE, the caliphate laid siege to Constantinople with a fleet and army so vast it choked the Bosporus. But the city had Greek fire, a secret weapon hurled from bronze tubes that clung to water and burned even on waves. The fire consumed ships and men. The siege failed. Snow fell over the Golden Horn that winter. The empire had survived, battered, poor, but intact. Through the next centuries, Byzantium became a creature of resilience. It transformed under pressure, bending like gold leaf without snapping. Bureaucracy hardened into Byzantine complexity. Titles multiplied. Eunuchs ran the palace. Spies littered the court. Icons became sacred currency. Civil wars were common. Assassinations frequent. But learning endured. Manuscripts were copied. Medicine advanced. Diplomats weaved webs between Turks, Slavs, and Franks. In 843 CE, after a long and bitter conflict over icons, the iconoclast controversy, the empire reaffirmed its love for sacred images. Churches again filled with mosaics of Christ, Mary, and saints whose faces glowed with gold halos. This aesthetic would soon cross into Slavic lands. In 862 CE, a new mission set out. Cyril and Methodius, two Byzantine monks, created a script to bring Orthodox Christianity to the Slavs. The Cyrillic alphabet, born from this mission, would carry faith and literacy deep into Rus and Bulgaria. Byzantium had lost lands, but gained souls. And in 976 CE, a Macedonian-born emperor, Basil II, rose to the throne. He was cold, ascetic, relentless, a soldier emperor who had reigned for nearly 50 years. He broke the power of the great noble families and focused his fury on the Bulgarian Empire, Byzantium's northern rival. After decades of war, he defeated them in 1014 CE, allegedly blinding 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, leaving every 100th man with one eye to guide the rest home. The Bulgars called him Basil the Bulgar Slayer. The empire called him Savior. Basil too died in 1025 CE, leaving the empire at its greatest territorial extent in 4 centuries. The treasury overflowed. The borders were fortified. Trade thrived in harbors stretching from Venice to Antioch. And yet, what he built with discipline, others squandered with vanity. His successors, lacking both vision and rigor, sank into luxury. They celebrated in palaces, whispered in court, and appointed favorites over generals. The army atrophied. Provinces festered with corruption. Within decades, the gold veneer began to peel. Far to the east, a new power gathered on horseback. The Seljuk Turks, hardened by steppe winds and a warrior faith, marched westward. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, Emperor Romanus IV led his troops into Anatolia and was betrayed by his own generals. The result was disaster. The Byzantines lost not just a battle, but the spine of their heartland. Turkish tribes flooded into Asia Minor. And for the first time, peasants looked east and saw no imperial banners. In desperation, Byzantium turned west to Latin Christendom. It was a gamble soaked in irony. For centuries, the Byzantine elite had viewed Westerners as crude, half-barbaric relics. But now, the emperor needed their swords. A plea for aid was sent to Rome, and the Pope, eager to unite Christendom under his own cross, answered with fire. The First Crusade arrived in 1096, a tide of knights, priests, merchants, and pilgrims bearing steel and scripture. They passed through Constantinople like guests and left like conquerors. Though the Byzantines regained some cities, the real winners were the Crusaders who carved out kingdoms for themselves in the Levant. Relations grew bitter. Trust shattered. The Latins despised Byzantine diplomacy. The Greeks despised Latin arrogance. By 1204, the fragile alliance ruptured entirely. In the most stunning betrayal of the medieval world, the Fourth Crusade diverted to Constantinople. Instead of marching on Jerusalem, they sacked the Christian capital of the East. Churches were looted. Nuns were raped. Horses were stabled in Hagia Sophia. Gold leaf was peeled from icons. The emperor fled. Latin crusaders declared a Western puppet state, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. For 57 years, Byzantium survived in exile. Fragments of empire scattered across Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. But empires are stubborn creatures. In 1261, Michael VIII. Palaiologos, a soldier-statesman of sharp intellect, recaptured Constantinople. The city he re-entered was a husk. Walls scorched, population halved, libraries pillaged. Still, the Byzantine eagle flew again above its ruins. Yet this rebirth was not Renaissance, only resistance. The empire was poor. Trade routes had shifted. Italian merchants controlled the seas. The Ottomans, a new Muslim dynasty rising in Anatolia, began to encircle them like a noose. For 2 more centuries, Byzantium lingered. It defended with diplomacy, married its daughters to enemies, and borrowed gold it could never repay. The Palaiologian dynasty governed with prayer and theater. Taxes rose, the army shrank. Provinces declared independence or fell under foreign sway. And yet, inside the shrinking capital, a final brilliance flared. Byzantine scholars, fluent in Greek texts long forgotten in the West, preserved Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy. Their manuscripts, carried westward by refugees, would ignite the European Renaissance. The dying empire became a bridge between ancient memory and modern mind. But Constantinople could not live on memory alone. By 1453, the Ottomans had grown into an empire of their own. Mehmed II, barely 21, was a scholar of siegecraft, fluent in Greek and Arabic, a strategist with a poet's ambition. He saw Constantinople not as a city, but as destiny. In April, he encircled it with 80,000 troops, siege towers, and giant cannons cast by Hungarian engineers. One so vast, it took 60 oxen to move. Inside, Emperor Constantine from Palaiologos, last of a line stretching back 1,000 years, commanded a few thousand defenders, Greeks, Genoese, and volunteers from across Christendom. They patched the walls, prayed in Hagia Sophia, and waited. The bombardment began. Stone walls cracked. Night fires painted domes with ash. On May 29, 1453, after 53 days, the final assault began. The Janissaries breached the walls at dawn. The emperor fought in the streets and vanished, likely slain amid the rubble. Looters swarmed the palaces. The last chants echoed under Hagia Sophia's dome, then fell silent beneath the echo of Muslim prayers. Constantinople had fallen. Yet the empire's story did not end in dust. Its flame traveled. Greek scholars fled west, carrying scrolls under cloaks. In Florence and Venice, their teachings revived ancient logic, astronomy, medicine. The Renaissance wore Roman bones and Byzantine blood. Orthodox Christianity endured from Moscow to Mount Athos. Even the Ottomans in time called themselves Caesars in their own tongue, Kaiser-i-Rum. And the city itself, battered, renamed Istanbul, yet still magnificent, remained a beacon. Its mosques echoed Hagia Sophia. Its bazaars bustled like Roman forums. Its streets, layered in centuries, still bore the ghost of the world's longest-lived empire. They had called it Nova Roma, New Rome. And though it fell, it never truly disappeared. It morphed, bled, whispered through ages. The Byzantine Empire, born from Rome's twilight, died at history's gate. But it left behind a world reshaped, in law, faith, art, language, and memory. An empire of paradoxes, of saints and schemers, of siege towers and scrolls. It endured for 1,000 years after the fall of its western twin. And in every cracked mosaic, every illuminated codex, every Renaissance cathedral whose architect once studied a dome over the Bosporus, it lives. Empires fall, but echoes survive them. When the last Latin breath left the walls of Constantinople, Rome did not die. It simply dissolved into memory, carved into marble, chiseled into law, and whispered through the veins of 1,000 nations unborn. The legacy of Rome is not a single monument, not a date on a crumbled tablet, but a quiet, persistent thrum beneath the surface of the modern world. Roads that still run, tongues that still echo, and laws that still bind. Start with the stones. The Roman road network, once stretching 400,000 kilometers, was not merely a convenience for marching legions. It was a blueprint for statecraft. Many still form the base layers beneath Europe's highways. England's Watling Street became the A2. France's Via Domitia cut still beneath vines and villages. All roads lead to Rome wasn't a proverb. It was an infrastructural reality. Roads connected markets, garrisons, forums, and frontier watchtowers. They channeled grain from Egypt to Ostia, timber from Gaul, and silver from Hispania. Arteries of an empire that fed itself by precision and schedule. But beyond stone, Rome left language. The Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, are all descendants of vulgar Latin, the soldier's tongue shaped more by boots and merchants than by poets. Even English, though Germanic at root, is thick with Latin. In its law, justice, its medicine, vini cavae, and its diplomacy, status quo, summit, consul. Latin persisted as the language of scholarship, science, and scripture long after Rome's banners fell. Newton's Principia Mathematica was written in Latin. So was Galileo's condemnation. In architecture, Rome bequeathed more than stone. It passed down a grammar of space. Domes, arches, basilicas, aqueducts. They were not just beautiful, they were intelligent. Roman concrete, composed with volcanic ash, endured for millennia, stronger under seawater than above. Their aqueducts could carry millions of gallons per day, using only gravity and a slight incline. The Pantheon's dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, has survived fires, invasions, and weather that toppled younger buildings around it. Renaissance engineers studied it. American architects imitated it. Its proportions inspired everything from St. Peter's Basilica to the U.S. Capitol dome. The Roman legal mind may be its most powerful ghost. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Justinian in the 6th century, became the backbone of Western legal tradition. Property rights, contracts, civil liability, ideas refined in Roman courts echo through modern jurisprudence. Even the concept of citizenship, a legal identity separate from ethnicity or birthplace, is a Roman construct honed through centuries of expanding, absorbing, and assimilating the known world. And then there is Rome's idea of empire itself. The title Caesar mutated into Kaiser in Germany and Tsar in Russia. Napoleon crowned himself emperor not merely to rule France, but to claim lineage to Rome's grandeur. Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, Roman, nor an empire, but the name endured for a millennium. Powered by association alone, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, called itself Basileia Romaean to the very end, insisting they were still Rome, still eternal. But legacies are not all marble and metals. Some are shadows. Rome taught the world how to unify and how to fracture. Its bureaucracy inspired modern governments. Yet its over-centralization also forecast their downfalls. When the Senate lost purpose, when local governors bowed too quickly to distant authority, corruption bred in the cracks. Provincial resentment simmered. Taxation became extortion. Bureaucrats enriched themselves at the edges, while emperors built golden statues at the center. The lessons of Rome's decline are studied in quiet rooms by policymakers to this day. Overreach, decadence, inequality. These are not just the past's poisons. Its military genius, too, is double-edged. Rome professionalized the army, crafting machines of discipline and loyalty. But by the 3rd century, emperors rose and fell by the will of the legions. Generals who should have guarded borders marched on the capital. Internal security bled resources needed for frontier defense. And yet the Roman model of a standing army, with logistics, ranks, and retirement benefits, still underpins modern militaries. The eagle standards were copied not just in symbolism, but in organization. From Napoleonic France to 20th century fascist regimes who stole Roman aesthetics to conjure myths of power. The Romans also left behind urbanism as a political tool. Their cities were not simply places to live. They were staged settings for loyalty. Amphitheaters, baths, forums, each stone was propaganda. "See how well you are governed," they whispered in their layout, in their plumbing, in the daily ritual of the grain dole. The idea that citizenship brings not just rights, but comfort is Roman, and remains central to social contracts today. Even religion was reshaped by Rome. Though the old gods faded into mythology, Christianity, once persecuted in back alleys and catacombs, was sculpted into an empire's image. Latin became its sacred tongue. Bishops dressed like senators. Cathedrals echoed basilicas. Saints replaced household gods on city corners. And when Constantine moved the capital east, when he walked through the gates of Byzantium and named it Constantinople, he carried both cross and eagle in one hand. Rome's end did not come all at once, nor did it end in one place. The Western Empire fell in 476 CE, but the Eastern Empire survived nearly 1,000 years longer. Byzantine scholars copied ancient texts as Europe darkened. It was through them, through Arabic translation and Constantinopolitan preservation, that Plato and Aristotle survived. That Ptolemy's astronomy and Galen's medicine reached Renaissance Italy. That Rome, through paradox, helped birth the Enlightenment. Even rebellion against Rome became part of its legacy. The very revolutionaries who tore down monarchies in the 18th century quoted Cicero and Cato. In 1776, when America declared independence, its founding fathers saw themselves as new Romans. Their republic had a senate. Their coins bore Latin phrases. Their monuments rose in marble, echoing temples long buried. Washington, Jefferson, and Adams read Livy not for nostalgia, but for instruction. Rome was a teacher, not always gentle, not always just, but profound. It taught that empires must build, not only conquer, that roads matter more than crowns, that a law code can outlive a king, that ideas, once shaped in stone or ink, can travel farther than any legion. And above all, it proved that greatness is not a moment, but a motion, the compounding of decisions, deeds, and dreams across time. Its ruins still watch us. In Britain, Hadrian's Wall runs like a scar across green hills. In France, the Pont du Gard still arches clean over river waters. In Turkey, the dome of Hagia Sophia curves against the sky, once Christian, then Islamic, now museumed, yet still Roman in its bones. In Italy, of course, the Colosseum gapes open like a fossilized wound. Tourists filtering through arches where gladiators once died, to the roar of citizens who no longer remember their names. But perhaps the greatest legacy is invisible. The calendar on your wall, its months named after Roman gods and emperors. The Senate meetings behind modern governments, the concrete beneath your feet, the Latin roots in your tongue, the citizen's right to trial, the idea that laws, not men, should rule. These are the ghosts of Rome, not mourned, but lived. Because Rome never truly ended. It transformed, it rebranded, It migrated into the minds of architects and revolutionaries, into constitutions and novels, into the quiet pride of marble cities and concrete capitals. Every civilization that seeks order and law, every government that drafts a code, every child who learns of Caesar or Cicero, continues the Roman story. And perhaps that's how all empires live on. Not in domination, but in memory. Not in temples, but in sentences. Not in power, but in example. Rome was not eternal, but its influence just might be. Now here are 5 of the most fascinating facts about this gigantic empire. Fact 1. Nero's Golden House, Domus Aurea, featured a revolving dining room powered entirely by human effort and primitive ball bearings. Guests sat in a circular platform that rotated while flower petals and perfume rained from a hidden ceiling mechanism, all designed to mimic the heavens turning above them, centuries before modern motorized technology. Fact 2. Roman concrete was self-healing. Their engineers embedded quicklime into volcanic ash mortars, which reacted with seawater to form new crystals and seal cracks automatically. This is why their coastal piers still stand after 2,000 years, and why MIT researchers only recently confirmed the mechanism in 2023. Fact 3. The Roman postal system, cursus publicus, could relay urgent military messages up to 240 kilometers in 24 hours, using horses, relay stations, and precise distance markers every 12 kilometers. That's faster than many medieval systems that came over 1,000 years later. Fact 4. Lead water pipes in Pompeii were booby-trapped. Plumbers embedded hidden metal barbs to wound anyone trying to illegally tap into the aqueduct. Some stopcocks were sealed with lead tags stamped by the state, and tampering could incur the death penalty. Fact 5. At the bottom of the sea near Baiae, the floors of a sunken imperial villa still shine with brilliant colored marble mosaics. 8 meters underwater, these opus sectile panels retain their rainbow glow because salt water preserves the pigment, making them the best preserved Roman floors on Earth and only visible to scuba divers.